Should we take 2 or 3?
I'll just speak. So you've been using the kind of nice term sustainable growth throughout this. But even in the developed country, we have no political economic model for sustainable growth. And next year we have the Paris conference, where the main source of conflict is going to be between the developed and the developing countries as to who has to cut their emissions. The countries that have very low living standards and haven't emitted but are suffering are the ones that have already burnt their fuels and got rich doing so. And so my question is, at what extent are we a paradox where raising our living standards and cutting climate change emissions are incompatible? In the fact that if all our developing countries are going to follow the China model, that is clearly not sustainable for the world.
So my question is related to the question that this girl asked before. Juan Pedro seemed to be implying that possibly the role of the state is to help facilitate market growth. I'm just wondering what any of you think in relation to the creation of welfare states as a mechanism for redistribution and protection of population health, etc. If you think that this should be, in a European sense, this creation of welfare states, whether that should be a goal for the global south to create this mechanism of a welfare state to provide a mode of social protection for the population.
Don't worry, I'll just shout. I have also somewhat follow-on, but I'm not going to talk about economics. Just picking up on Natalie's earlier point about the lack of politics in the MDGs as they were. It's all very wonderfully well-meaning incorporating the politics of kind of serious structural change and states and economic inequality and trade laws and the arms trade and carbon emissions and crony capitalism I have down here. But how exactly can the UN lead on that? And how do you go about implementing serious political change in order to address inequality, since that is really the only way of doing that?
That was a great set of questions. Should we go in a different order? Natalie, would you like to start?
Yeah. If I maybe pick up on the question about the welfare state and do we need one in developing countries, many of the livelihoods programs that are being used by development practitioners do kind of have resemblance to welfare states. So, for example, most NGOs target under fives. You could draw a parallel to child benefits. There's something that we call social protection. It's giving a small kind of stipend of money to a family. Maybe they own a goat or cattle. You could liken that to a benefit. Most NGOs probably target the sick and elderly. There are definite parallels. You already have some developing countries picking up this notion of social protection and social safety nets. In Ethiopia, there's a very well-known program run by the government where they give a regular amount of cash to their populations at particular times of year when they know that people will be going through what they call a hunger gap. I think that the horse has already bolted the stable. We are seeing the beginnings of welfare states emerging in some developing countries that have the will and the infrastructure and the resource to start putting down some type of provision for women, children, and the most elderly. The question, I think, is not whether it will happen, is how far it will go.
I can very good question, the one about sustainability, because we have left that aspect out, I think. And it's very important in the design of the new development goals, actually. If the developing world is going to follow the pattern of China, the whole planet is going to collapse. That's not possible. That's not possible. The Chinese have been able to do it because in some way they are, how can I say it in a politically correct form? But they are too big to be challenged by anyone. So they have followed their own way. They are being now sort of receiving a call of attention from the rest of the world to reduce their levels of pollution, because that is clearly not sustainable. I think that precisely in that aspect is where the global north has a responsibility with respect to developing countries. Because when they developed, certainly they polluted a lot. And I'm talking particularly of this country. The pollution in this country in the 1700s and 1800s during the Industrial Revolution was enormous, enormous. So I think the global north has a responsibility, as the countries themselves have a responsibility towards the people for raising them from poverty and providing education, providing infrastructure in those countries. I think the responsibility for a sustainable planet comes mainly from the developed countries. We cannot impose on poor developing economies, the obligation of trying to protect the environment at the same time as they're making a huge effort to raise people out of poverty. So I think these schemes like debt for nature swaps, something like debt for nature swaps, basically in which international institutions like the UN are saying to countries like Brazil or Ecuador, if you decide not to exploit this part of the rainforest for oil or for timber or whatever it is, or for minerals, we will condone, say, 30% of your external debt. We will take care of that. I think that is very important. So I think that at the same time as development countries are making a huge effort to raise people out of poverty, developed countries should help and should assume their responsibility, because it's a global responsibility. To protect the environment is something which goes in benefit of us all. It's not something that benefits only the countries in which the measures are taken, but rather we have only one atmosphere. We have only one global ecosystem, and it's all dependent. So that the climate here in Europe is very dependent on the rainforest in Brazil and on the glaciers in Patagonia. So we are all responsible. So I think here, really, the developed countries should take the responsibility and financially provide the resources necessary to protect the environment, help the developing countries protect the environment. There was another point, the welfare states. I don't think the developing countries can afford to have welfare states, not at least of the type that we have in Europe. Of course, they can have some safety nets. Of course, they have to have them, and they have social programs for very poor people to provide for basic education, for basic nutrition, basic health, etc. But the type of welfare state that we know in Europe is impossible. There are no resources for that. On the other hand, I don't particularly think that it might be the right model for an economy. There are basically two models for developed countries: the American model and the European model, right? In the American model, the welfare state is very very strong. In the American model, they have a rather weak welfare state and more safety nets type of things. I'm not sure about which is the right model, but certainly the developing countries cannot afford welfare states.
So I think on the welfare state thing, I would say it's a process. I think the desirability of the welfare state, state provision of basic services, and ensuring that the poorest are not left out of fundamental rights and needs is what a lot of people are working to. The also familiar and all the rest, the various cash transfer schemes. It is a thing that states need to invest in as part of their development trajectory in order, as we were saying before, because you need these things in order to increase your chances to grow and vice versa. But you can't transplant all of the advantages of that a Norwegian citizen has directly into Tanzania because there's no money for it. So it's how much can you do at a given stage of development and priority, and then it comes down to fighting over state resources and state priorities. And I do think that there is that there is room, that developing countries have room to do more for their poorer citizens, I would say, in a lot of cases. So more state provision of services and investment in pro-poor services is necessary. On I think the environmental one and the UN goals, essentially how the UN goals help, I think are kind of related, which is that the issue of green growth is partially referred to in the new goals in terms of, as you were saying, about technology transfer and about having sustainability built in with development. What it doesn't do is force anybody's hand. And so if it's going to happen, it will need to be funded by, so if the poor countries can't afford to take more expensive technology routes to electrification or whatever, they can be subsidised to do so, because I think it would require, I think the language of responsibility, I suspect, won't get us as far as as the hope that enlightened self-interest might, because we all share one thing and nobody else can do it. It's a bit how actually to get that kind of spending, to get rich countries investing in cheaper energy in developing countries and that kind of stuff. Speaks again to the issue of, for all the UN goals, this is all very lovely, but how actually is this going to happen? And there is an issue there, as I was saying, we have to have humility about what goals can achieve. And they frame the thinking, they put out there some priorities, but how things happen is, how change happens is a political struggle that people have to engage with, that developed people in their own countries, in rich countries, in developing countries, have to fight to get the changes that we've agreed. And the advantage of the UN structure so far has been it's very strongly helped, I think, people to articulate their needs and demand change and assert that their demands are reasonable, that their demands are agreed in sort of coherent. So it gives strength to those advocates, but it doesn't achieve anything on its own. I think that the political change, I mean, the environmental, for the environment is perhaps even harder than for development, for getting people to pick up their responsibilities. And it's not, if we get a wonderful set of sustainable development goals with a target for 2030, what next? There are global agreements that have fallen by the wayside, and there are global agreements that have had significant impact, or that have been part of an important change, and that depends on how people work around them, how people feel about them over time, and that's outside the process. But I think the goals are helping to frame a lot of the issues. People weren't talking about inequality before the way they are now. People weren't talking about environmental sustainability alongside development the way they are now. So that's all good stuff, but it's not the be all and end all. I don't think anyone's pretending that it is.
I'll just jump in for a minute, because I think there's been a bit of a consensus around the fact that there should be some social protection, but a full-fledged welfare state is not feasible. And just to point out, to kind of be a bit more provocative, I think there are real political battle lines about what is best provided by the market and what is best provided by the state. I think water is a good example where that, there was an attempt to push for water as best provided by the market through privatization. There was pushback, but we can go through and say one by one what aspects of health, of shelter, of education. I mean, we can go through the list. And I think that is perhaps, we don't know what's going to happen even with the proposal of the Sustainable Development Goals, let alone the sort of long implementation. So it's maybe something to watch how those battles play out.